In the sky above us, there are these things called satellites. They're like little helpers in space, helping us with things like our phones and GPS. Some big countries like the United States and China are kind of like in a competition to be the boss of these satellites. You see, these countries have really big economies with lots of money, and they rely on these satellites to make their economies work smoothly. So, they're making some super high-tech weapons that could harm or even destroy satellites. It's like a chess game, and whoever can mess up the other satellites first might shout, "Checkmate!" That's pretty intense, right? This space stuff is no longer just about exploring or looking at stars. It's like a new kind of battleground where countries are trying to outsmart each other. So it's important for us to understand how all of this works, because it's not just about satellites, it's about the future of our world in the sky. Space diplomacy. International relations in space are getting more complicated, and there are some reasons for it. Maybe it's because the sun is really close, just 1,000,000 miles away, or maybe it's because leaders from different countries can't seem to agree on things, like what's happening in Ukraine. This Ukraine situation even caused problems on the International Space Station, where astronauts live and work together. In 2021, Russia did some experiments in space that created a lot of space junk, and the space station had to move to avoid it. Back in 2019, the person in charge of the U.S. Space Command warned that China might try to blind our satellites during a war. This means they could make our space equipment stop working. When we see situations like these happening during times of war, it starts to seem like conflict in space is just a matter of time. Even organizations like NATO, which is a group of countries that work together for security, realized this in 2019. They said that space is like a new battlefield, just like land, air, and cyberspace. War always finds its way to places where countries want to protect themselves. Many countries depend on space for military and economic reasons, and so do their enemies. If they play their cards right, meaning they use the right strategies, they can use space as a way to hurt each other. They can do this by using special satellites that can jam or disrupt the electronic signals of enemy satellites. They can also use laser weapons to blind or damage those enemy satellites. Another idea is to use kinetic weapons, which are like space missiles, to destroy enemy space equipment. Some companies even plan to put weapons in space, like satellites with weapons on board. But not all space activities are about weapons. Some companies want to put satellites in space for peaceful purposes, like communication and science. However, there are rules and agreements in place to try and keep space as a peaceful and safe place. For example, there's an agreement that says you can't put nuclear weapons in space. So, while space might be getting more complicated when it comes to international relations, there are still efforts to keep it a place where people can work together and explore the universe without causing harm. Space weapons unleashed. In space, things work a bit differently than here on Earth. You see, space doesn't have an atmosphere, which is like the layer of air around our planet. This makes it tough for many regular weapons, like bullets, to work in space because they need air to push against. But there are some really cool space weapons that scientists and experts are looking at. One of the top contenders for space weapons are lasers. These are super powerful because they don't have to deal with air resistance like on Earth. However, lasers have a challenge. As they travel through space, their beams spread out, which makes them weaker the farther they go. Space is massive, so this can be a problem. Now, let's talk about railguns. Railguns are like super-fast shooters that launch high-speed projectiles, kind of like really speedy ball bearings. These projectiles don't need air to get to their target, so they can go a really long way without losing power. Unlike bullets on Earth, there's no bullet drop in space. This means railguns can be a simple and effective way to take down slower-moving satellites. When it comes to lasers, their strength weakens as they travel through space, and there's so much space out there that the weakening can be a problem. But railgun projectiles, those speedy ball bearings, don't have this issue, as long as the railgun has enough power to launch them. These little projectiles can speed towards their target without losing much strength, which is pretty cool. One important thing to note is that even though railguns are effective, they may take a bit more time to hit their target in space compared to other weapons. But when it comes to going after slower satellites, they do the job pretty well. So, while experts are figuring out which space weapon is the best fit for future space missions, railguns are definitely strong contenders for being the true anomaly wolves of space weaponry. It's like picking the best tool for the job in a vast and challenging cosmic playground. China's space laser mystery. In 2022, a report from the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency talked about something really interesting. They said that China has these laser systems on the ground, and these lasers have different levels of power. Some of them are so strong that they can reach things way up in space, like satellites, even if they're more than 60 miles away. That's pretty far. These laser systems are in different places, and some have been caught in the act of aiming at stuff in space. The report also talked about something called anti-satellite laser weapons in East Xinjiang Korla. This is a place in China where they test these kinds of weapons. The U.S. government was worried that China was working on technology to mess up or even take control of foreign satellites, making them useless. They found patterns in the images of 2 of these laser weapons. Now, here's the really cool part. Researchers in China have been working on something called a relativistic klystron amplifier, or RKA for short. It's also known as a directed energy weapon. This weapon can do some impressive stuff. It can create strong blasts of energy, like a 5-megawatt blast, and use it to either disable or destroy satellites in space. Imagine a super powerful burst of energy that can zap satellites. Unlike the ground-based weapons in East Korla, this new weapon could even be put on a satellite itself. That means it can get really close to its target in space and fry their sensitive electronics. But building a weapon like this isn't easy. The RKA had to overcome a bunch of challenges. First, it needed a lot of power to work against big satellites in space. Then, it had to have fancy technology to control the energy beam and make sure it didn't get messed up by the atmosphere. Plus, it needed high-tech tracking and targeting abilities to aim precisely at the right target. China says the RKA isn't really a directed energy weapon, but there's still a bit of mystery around it. No one's quite sure what it's meant for. So, it's a bit like a puzzle, and we'll have to see how it all unfolds in the future. But one thing's for sure. Space is becoming a place where some really high-tech stuff is happening. Kinetic kill vehicles. The United States is keeping a close eye on what China is doing in space, and they have a bunch of strategies to respond to China's space advancements. One way they're doing this is by using lasers. Yep, lasers in space. These lasers can help with communication and sharing information quickly. Think of them like super-fast text messages sent between satellites. Another cool thing they're working on is something called kinetic kill vehicles. These are like space versions of kamikaze drones we see on Earth. Imagine a satellite carrying a tiny vehicle that can zoom towards its target and take it out when needed. It's like having a space superhero on standby. They're also thinking about turning satellites themselves into these space heroes, if it makes sense. Back in the day, there was a budget to fund these kinetic kill vehicles, but it was under a fancy name, Near Infrared Experimental Program. Unfortunately, it ended in 2015, but that doesn't mean they stopped working on it. It might be a secret project now, but that's not all. They're also looking at ways to jam signals from space. It's kind of like when your Wi-Fi gets weak at home, but in space, there can be all sorts of obstacles. They're figuring out how to make these jammers work better from space so that they can control communication and data. And speaking of data, they're planning to send fleets of small spacecraft into space. These little guys can share laser data with each other, which is super useful. It's like having a team of space buddies that can talk to each other really well. They're doing this to make space communication faster and more efficient. Navigating the cosmos. Back in 2002, during the time of President Bush, the U.S. government started some projects related to space. These projects were about making things in space that could be used for both offense, meaning attacking, and defense, meaning protecting. But they didn't last long and were canceled in 2004. However, these projects were like the starting point for the U.S. military to think about space in a new way. Now, fast forward to today, and the U.S. has a bunch of laser weapons on the ground. These lasers can be used to attack things in space or even make them better at doing that job. One of the cool weapons is called the Helios Demshorad Shield, and it's not just a dream anymore. It's real. It's like a shield to protect against things in space. The U.S. Air Force and Navy, along with some companies, are always working on new ideas. One of these ideas is putting a jammer on a satellite in space. This jammer could be on its own or with other satellites that can move around. Think of it like a space gadget that can mess up the signals of other stuff in space. A long time ago, in 2003, the Air Force Research Laboratory tested a satellite called XSS-10 SSS-11 that could move around in space. Then, in 2005, they launched another satellite called Automatic Navigation and Guidance Experiment for local space. These satellites were like the early versions of what they're working on now. Now, there's a whole group of these satellites in space, and they're up high in what's called geostationary orbit. That's a really special place in space because it's where satellites can stay in one spot and watch things on Earth. These satellites are part of something called the Geosynchronous Space Situational Awareness Program, and they're meant to help protect stuff in space, like communications satellites. The thing is, these satellites can move around and do important jobs, but they can't really attack or destroy things in space. So, they're not like the space superheroes that have weapons like railguns, laser blasters, or radio frequency jammers. But people are talking about making these kinds of space weapons, and it's a serious topic of discussion. However, many people hope that space doesn't become a place filled with deadly weapons. Space is amazing with all its planets and stars, and it would be best if it stays a peaceful and beautiful place for everyone to explore and enjoy.